At 35, he earns more than he imagined. At 23, he worked when others slept. At 35, his income feels stable. At 23, his habits were not. At 35, money flows consistently. At 23, he built the systems. At 35, he walks with confidence. At 23, he walked alone. At 35, his skills pay him daily. At 23, he invested time into learning them. At 35, life feels controlled. At 23, discipline controlled him. At 35, his work has value. At 23, he worked without validation. At 35, he earns with ease. At 23, nothing was easy. At 35, he lives comfortably. At 23, he lived carefully. At 35, he makes smart decisions. At 23, he learned from mistakes. At 35, his mindset is strong. At 23, he built it daily. At 35, his results speak loudly. At 23, his work was silent. At 35, he controls his time. At 23, he respected it. At 35, he grows financially. At 23, he grew mentally. At 35, stress about money is gone. At 23, pressure shaped him. At 35, he earns from multiple sources. At 23, he created them slowly. At 35, his life feels stable. At 23, he avoided instability. At 35, he understands money deeply. At 23, he studied it consistently. At 35, success feels normal. At 23, effort was constant. At 35, he lives with confidence. At 23, he doubted but continued. At 35, he enjoys the rewards. At 23, he focused on the process. At 35, he is financially free. At 23, he built financial discipline. At 35, everything looks smooth. At 23, nothing was smooth. At 35, his life reflects consistency. At 23, consistency was a choice. At 35, he stands as proof. Because 6 figures at 35 doesn't begin at 35. It begins at 23.